This video is a supplemental lecture that expands upon material covered in the video entitled Stoic Indifference, Harm, and Confronting Death, and you can find a link to that video in the description section below. Unlike many other philosophical systems, the Stoic philosophy is meant to be intensely practical. It is not intended to be merely a collection of theoretical ideas that we might find true or false, or intriguing or ridiculous. Rather, it is supposed to constitute a very way of living our lives. Specifically, the Stoics sought to describe what it means to live a good, happy, and flourishing human life. However, they also realized the difficult and demanding nature of the Stoic way of life. To live a genuinely Stoic life, it is not enough to merely accept Stoic principles on an intellectual level. Those principles must be embodied, trained, and put into practice. Here we will examine these two aspects of Stoic thought. That is, we will discuss how Stoicism is supposed to lead to human flourishing and well-being, and then in addition, we will also turn our attention to the process of training for the Stoic life. Given the difficulty of mastering our emotions and controlling our desires, we might wonder, how do we begin this process? Is there reason to believe that we can be successful? What sorts of virtues are essential to the Stoic life? And how does undertaking the arduous task of Stoic training ultimately produce human flourishing? The present video will address each of these points by focusing primarily on Epictetus's Enchiridion. At the end of the previous video, which was entitled Desire, Aversion, and Stoic Self-Control, and which you can find linked in the description section below, we saw that, at least for beginners in the Stoic life, Epictetus recommends that we get rid of all desire. But one problem with this advice, however, is that, to put it bluntly, it seems impossible. Living requires action. Action requires striving toward goals. And it is desire which makes us care about those goals and motivates us to pursue them. But if all of that is true, then how can we live without desire? In the last sentence of Enchiridion section 2, Epictetus does seem to recognize this problem. In response, he suggests that we may be permitted to pursue our desires and engage in practical life, provided we do so in the proper way. Specifically, when we pursue or avoid anything, we need to do so with discretion, gentleness, and moderation. But what does this mean? What does it mean to pursue a desire with gentleness instead of presumably violence or abrasiveness? What is the meaning of Epictetus's metaphorical language here? What does this actually look like in practical terms? To answer these questions, consider the example Epictetus discusses in Enchiridion section 4. Epictetus tells us that, when you set about any action, remind yourself of what nature the action is. If you are going to bathe, represent to yourself the incidents usual in the bath. Some persons pouring out, others pushing in, others scolding, others pilfering. And thus you will more safely go about this action if you say, in addition, I will now go to bathe and keep my own will in harmony with nature. In this example, someone desires to go to a public bath. Notice that Epictetus doesn't say it is wrong to pursue this desire. Rather, he focuses on describing what it means to pursue this desire in the right way. And this requires that we do not allow ourselves to become anxious or upset by the entirely predictable obstacles and inconveniences of our lives. Before going to the bath, we need to represent the incidents usual in the bath. We need to remind ourselves that in crowded public spaces, there will be people pushing, scolding, pilfering, and acting in many disagreeable ways. We need to have realistic expectations about our planned course of action. And this is because doing so allows us to keep our will in harmony with nature. Because our desires attach us to certain outcomes and can even attach us to unrealistic and idealistic versions of those outcomes, our desires lead us to disappointment when they are not properly moderated and regulated. When this person imagines visiting the public bath, in his mind he probably imagines being able to relax and unwind. But suppose that in reality, upon arriving at the bath, he finds that the other bathers are rude and inconsiderate. He finds that his hopes for a relaxing afternoon have been dashed. And such occurrences are not uncommon. There is often a substantial difference between real life and the idealistic expectations of our undisciplined imagination. And this is why it is vital to pursue our desires with discretion, gentleness, and moderation. Instead of being so violently and steadfastly attached to our idealized hopes, we need to be able to accept the possibility of failure, or even just of partial success. We need to be able to accept that things may not go as planned. Yet such acceptance is impossible if we cling desperately to our desires and if we are beholden to some idealized, unrealistic conception of success. We might go to the public bath because we desire peace and relaxation, but many things, all of which might be outside of our control, could undermine our pursuit of that goal. So if that is our mindset, then disappointment and frustration are inevitable, and we will not be able to pursue our desires in a stoic manner. On the other hand, if we can endeavor after our goals while accepting the real possibility of failure, and without becoming attached and dependent upon success, then we will have found a gentle and moderate way of striving after what we want. We will have found a gentle and moderate way of living that doesn't threaten our inner tranquility and freedom. This mindset should guide every action that we take. If things do not go as we planned or as we hoped, then we should remind ourselves that our most fundamental desire was not necessarily to have a pleasant time at the public bath, although that would be nice. Rather, our true desire should be to keep our will in harmony with nature. And this means we need to conform our desires to how events actually unfold instead of to the idealized hopes of our imagination. And if we do this, then no obstacle should upset us. If the grocery store is crowded and the cashier is rude to you, remind yourself that keeping your will in accordance with nature is your main priority. Accept that it is not within your power to necessarily have an enjoyable shopping experience. We should take the same approach when we get stuck in traffic, are forced to complete pointless administrative tasks at work, have to change our plans because of inclement weather or illness, or are forced to face any other annoyance or inconvenience. These things can only upset us if we think it is within our power to do anything more than keep our will in accordance with nature. This is why Epictetus reminds us that men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of things. Whether we find some event disturbing depends entirely upon our point of view. If we have an uncompromising, unrelenting desire for some goal, and if we think our very well-being hinges upon successfully achieving that goal, then we are sure to be disturbed if we fail. By contrast, if our desire for that goal is gentle and moderate, then a failure need not disturb us. It is up to us whether an event harms us. It all depends upon the nature of our desire for the goal in question. And for the Stoic, this will be true of all of our desires, even the desire we have for the continuation of our own life. If we have an uncompromising desire for our own self-preservation, then we will find the thought of our own death to be terrible, and contemplating the inevitability of death will be a disturbing and anxiety-provoking ordeal. Yet the only reason death seems terrible, and the only reason someone could be terrified by death, is because of the view we take of death and the nature of our desire for life. If we desire continued life with uncompromising zeal, then death will seem unbearable, and the thought of our life coming to an end will indeed be terrifying. However, if on the other hand we have a moderate desire for continued life, a desire which soberly accepts the fact that our life must end, then we will realize that death is nothing terrible. Our desire for life will be tempered by recognizing life's finitude and death's inevitability. As such, whatever terror is associated with death really comes from our own notion of death. If we find the thought of death to be terrible, it is because we have allowed it to terrorize us. Given this, we might think that self-blame would be prevalent in the Stoic life. If all harm is merely a product of the view we choose to take of what has purportedly harmed us, and of the desires we permit ourselves to have, then it seems like we should only be able to blame ourselves when things don't go our way. After all, we are ultimately the party responsible for our own troubles. And in part, this is what Epictetus believes. He tells us that when we are hindered or disturbed or grieved, we should never impute it to others, but to ourselves and to our own views. The tendency to blame other people for our misfortunes is the action of an uninstructed person. But the person who has entered upon instruction in the Stoic way of life will only reproach himself. Yet we should also notice that Epictetus goes a step further than this. The person who is beginning his Stoic training refrains from blaming others, but the person who is perfectly instructed reproaches neither others nor himself. The perfectly instructed Stoic blames nobody, not even himself. But why is this? It is because the true Stoic, by inculcating moderate desire and a detached point of view, is immune from harm. The true Stoic cannot be disappointed because the true Stoic desires the attainment of his ends without being attached to those ends. So the Stoic has no reason to feel upset or disturbed even if he doesn't get what he wants in a certain sense. Consequently, the true Stoic never finds it necessary to blame anyone. In fact, blame itself only demonstrates that one has not yet fully embodied the Stoic way of life. We have seen thus far that Epictetus instructs us to keep our will in accordance with nature, and this concept is a vital part of Stoic philosophy. But what does it actually mean? What does Epictetus mean by nature? What does he mean by our will? What does it look like when we keep our will in alignment with nature? And what happens when our will is out of alignment with nature? The meaning of this concept is explained nicely in what I refer to as the Stoic principle for living well. And this principle tells us how to live a good life, and it is stated by Epictetus in Enchiridion, section 8. Demand not that events should happen as you wish, but wish them to happen as they do happen, and you will go on well. This principle succinctly states the foundation of the Stoic philosophy. If we demand that events happen in a particular way, then we will inevitably be disappointed. But if we desire only what we can control, and never desire any outcome that is beyond our power, then nothing that happens can upset our expectations. We will always wish that events happen just as they do happen, and again, not as we imagine they could happen in some ideal scenario. We can better understand this principle by comparing the Stoic way of living with the non-Stoic way of living. And we will see that what differentiates these approaches is the direction of influence between nature on the one hand and our will and desires on the other hand, which is found in each way of life. As such, we should begin by defining these important terms. As we have seen, our desires are mental acts whereby we wish for some state of affairs to come about. For instance, in the previous example, a person had a desire to relax at the public bath. The will refers to our capacity of choice, which we use in order to bring our desires to fruition. So, the person who wants to relax at the public bath would choose to go to the bath and perhaps try as best as he could to distance himself from those who would disturb him. Finally, nature refers to how events occur in the world. To our ears, the term nature might seem misleading. We tend to associate nature with entities like rocks, trees, mountains, and rivers that cannot exercise choice, or also sometimes with animals who presumably cannot exercise full rational choice in the way that human beings can. However, this is not what Epictetus means. By nature, he simply means the collection of every event that happens in the world. And according to this conception, it doesn't matter whether those events are caused by inanimate objects, plants, animals, or even human beings. So, what is the relationship between these things for the non-Stoic way of life? The non-Stoic tries to make nature conform to her desires and will. The non-Stoic wants various things: wealth, success, relaxation, a family, social relationships, and will make certain choices to obtain all of these things. In doing so, her purpose is to change the course of nature and cause events to happen according to her liking. The non-Stoic wants to relax at the public bath, so she avoids those who would disturb her. The non-Stoic wants a high salary, so she earns a degree in a high-paying professional field. The non-Stoic wants some candidate to win an election, so she helps that candidate's campaign. In each case, the non-Stoic has a desire which requires events in nature to happen in a certain way. The bath being calm instead of boisterous, performing well at the job interview instead of botching it, candidate A winning the election instead of candidate B. And consequently, through her actions, she hopes to make nature align with her desired outcome. But the reason this is not the Stoic approach is that the Stoic focuses only on what she can control. But it is not within our power to guarantee that events unfold in a certain way. We cannot control whether the public bath is relaxing, or whether we get the job, or whether our preferred candidate wins. There is a limited sphere of nature we can control, and that sphere exists within our own mind, our desires, beliefs, and goals. But outside of this narrow sphere, the way events unfold is not up to us. Thus, those who try to influence nature according to their own desires do not live as the Stoic does. In direct opposition to the Stoic principle of living well, such individuals demand that events happen as they wish. The Stoic approach, on the other hand, is precisely the opposite. The Stoic wishes for events to happen as they do happen. Instead of hoping that nature conforms to her will, the Stoic conforms her will to nature. The Stoic accepts what is beyond her power. If the Stoic is asked, "What do you want to happen?" her response would be, "Whatever actually does happen." And it makes sense that the Stoic would adopt this way of life. While our desires and will are within our power, nature itself is not. It is true that we can sometimes make it more likely that nature will conform to our desires through the choices we make. Certain choices do make certain outcomes more probable. But we are never in complete control of this. Thus, the non-Stoic way of life, in which we strive to make our desires and will dictate the course of nature, is ultimately doomed to futility and destined for disappointment. What the Stoic realizes is that there is one approach to life that can ensure our desires are satisfied. And that approach is conforming our desires and will to the course of nature by being able to calmly accept events as they actually occur. Returning to the previous example, the Stoics' foremost desire is not to have any particular kind of experience at the public bath. Perhaps a pleasant, relaxing experience would be preferable in a certain sense, but having that sort of experience is not her primary goal or desire. Rather, her primary desire is to keep her will in harmony with nature. Her primary goal is to be the sort of person who can accept the course of nature with dignity and tranquility, whatever the course of nature may turn out to be. And the ability to exercise this self-controlled acceptance requires the right sort of character and disposition. It requires that we are not out of humor with things that happen. It requires that we detach ourselves from what we imagine the optimal course of nature would be and instead reconcile ourselves to the reality of things. This is the key to living well. If we keep our will in harmony with nature and wish for events to happen as they actually do happen, then nothing can disappoint us, and we will go on well in our lives. We should notice that the Stoic principle for living well makes the good life equally available to all. Anyone can bring their desires into accordance with nature, no matter their social status or place in society. And this is because everyone is equally powerless to control their fundamental life circumstances. As Epictetus puts it, we are actors in a drama of such sort as the author chooses. We like to think that we are the authors of our own lives, that we are in control of our own destiny. And the messages that our culture gives to children often reinforce this very idea or conception. We tell the child, you can be whatever you want, or you can do whatever you set your mind to. And while these phrases are encouraging, in a certain sense, these messages are also actually quite naive. Nobody has complete control over their life. Nobody can make themselves into whatever they want. Numerous biological, psychological, social, cultural, and political realities will delimit our life outcomes. We are like an actor who acts out the script given to her. We have a role to play, and our actions do matter. But that role also severely limits our sphere of action. It is not up to us to become anything we want, or to satisfy every fanciful desire that is conjured by our imagination. While this might sound depressing, the good news is that from the Stoic point of view, living a good life doesn't require this type of control. It is not up to us whether we live the life of a poor man, cripple, ruler, or private citizen. However, we can control our desires and will, and we can control whether our desires and will conflict with the realities of life, or whether we bring our desires and will into harmony with those realities. It may not be our responsibility because it is not within our power to choose the part we play in our life's drama, but it is our responsibility to act well in the part we are given. This is why the Stoic philosophy can be embodied in people from very different walks of life. Two of the most well-known Stoic thinkers are Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Epictetus was born a slave while Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor. It is difficult to imagine two more differently situated individuals. However, each found the Stoic philosophy useful. Each saw it as a means of living well. And this is because the primary obstacles to our well-being are not determined by our political power, wealth, or social status. Instead, the real obstacles to living well come from within. They come from the challenges of bringing our will and desires into harmony with nature. It is this challenge that is faced by every human being, and it is this challenge that the Stoic philosophy is meant to help us overcome. Suppose it is true that achieving the good life requires aligning our desires with the course of nature. It could seem that this would imply that we should wholly abstain from the enjoyment of life's pleasures. After all, pursuing pleasurable experiences requires desiring a certain course of events. It requires that we prefer pleasurable states of affairs to painful ones, that we prefer success to failure, health to illness, and tranquility over anxiety. But this is directly contrary to the Stoic principle for living well. However, Epictetus does not hold that we must completely abstain from the good things in life. This is because there is a difference between pursuing a pleasure and enjoying a pleasure. He explains this point by having us consider how it would be appropriate to behave at a banquet. Remember that you must behave as at a banquet. Is anything brought round to you? Put out your hand and take a moderate share. Does it pass you by? Do not stop it. Is it not yet come? Do not yearn in desire towards it, but wait till it reaches you. If we were at a banquet, it would be inappropriate to immediately grasp at whatever food and drink that we could get our hands on. Rather, we should wait our turn, accept and enjoy whatever food and drink comes our way, and permit others to enjoy their share as well. We should not overindulge our appetites, but neither do we need to completely deny ourselves. So a person can enjoy the pleasures of the banquet without necessarily pursuing those pleasures in a way that makes them yearn in desire. If, for whatever reason, we are not given anything to eat or drink, then if our will is in accordance with nature as it should be according to Stoic principles, then we would calmly accept that outcome. However, if we are lucky enough to have good things bestowed upon us, then we need not turn our back on good fortune. We can enjoy those things with moderation. The same is true of any other enjoyment. We don't need to prohibit ourselves from enjoying the benefits of children, wife, office, and riches, provided we appreciate these things in the manner just described. That is, provided we enjoy these benefits without becoming hopelessly attached to them. There is nothing about enjoyment itself which is necessarily inconsistent with a Stoic life. And if we can enjoy the good things of life in this moderate fashion, then, according to Epictetus, we will be worthy to feast with the gods. Still, there is a qualification needed for even this moderate form of enjoyment. While we can live an honorable Stoic life while also partaking of certain enjoyments, the person who denies themselves completely does seem, according to Epictetus, to deserve even greater honor. Epictetus tells us that if you do not so much as take the things which are set before you, but are able even to forgo them, then you will not only be worthy to feast with the gods, but to rule with them also. It is difficult to know precisely what to take from this passage. He does clearly say here that the highest ideal of the Stoic life would be complete abstinence from all enjoyments. On the other hand, he also just said that living a Stoic life does not preclude us from enjoying any pleasure at all. Perhaps his point is that for mere mortal human beings, the only standard we can realistically achieve, and it itself is a standard that is already quite difficult, is that of moderately and passively enjoying the blessings of life without actively striving after them. But those who can completely disregard life's pleasures would have thereby attained the higher status of a god. Of course, the very fact that Epictetus describes such a person as a god could indicate that this may not be within our mortal human grasp. Still, the fact that the Stoic ideal may permit us to enjoy certain pleasures does not make it all that much easier to achieve. Detaching ourselves from desire and harmonizing our will with the course of nature are in fact exceedingly difficult things to do. These endeavors stretch the possibilities of human nature to their utmost limits. The demands of Stoic life seem to threaten to push human self-control beyond its capabilities. For this reason, living the Stoic way of life requires consistent training. In the next section of this video, we will take a closer look at some of Epictetus' recommendations for how we can train ourselves to live a Stoic life. In the Enchiridion, Epictetus discusses two aspects of Stoic training. First, he talks about the process of Stoic training, and then he also discusses the result or outcome of Stoic training. Now, given the nature of Stoicism, we would expect Epictetus to primarily focus on the process of Stoic practice. That is, the concrete steps we can take to control our desires and focus on what is within our power. And in fact, this is precisely what we do find in the Enchiridion. However, Epictetus also makes some important comments about the results of Stoic training, and we will examine these as well. The idea of developing a Stoic character can seem rather daunting. How can I train myself to suppress my desires? How can I achieve the stringent detachment that is demanded by Stoicism? Again, these tasks seem to stretch the very capabilities of human nature to its limits. And naturally, we might wonder whether we really have what it takes to even get close to accomplishing this goal. For this reason, Epictetus assures us that we have within ourselves the tools we need to surmount the obstacles of desire and aversion. Epictetus tells us that upon every accident, remember to turn towards yourself and inquire what faculty you have for its use. Whenever some accidental event threatens to upset our desires, facing that event properly requires that we first fortify ourselves. We must combat the tendency we have to feel upset, despairing, nervous, or anxious in response to these seemingly negative events. Of course, if accomplishing this required looking to something outside of ourselves, something like health, wealth, power, or even friendship, then the Stoic life would seem to be doomed from the outset. Nothing external to ourselves is within our power, and Stoicism requires that we only concern ourselves with what we can control. Thus, facing the challenges of life in a Stoic manner requires looking inside ourselves and marshaling our own faculties and abilities to meet the task at hand. Fortunately, we can be confident that we do in fact possess the faculties that we need. Epictetus explains that we can develop virtuous states of character that are conducive to a Stoic life. Here he gives three examples. One would be continence, a virtue of self-restraint in the face of temptation to sexual pleasure in particular; fortitude, or courage, the ability to face danger; and patience, our ability to delay gratification and tolerate discomfort. When we encounter a handsome person, we may need the virtue of continence to restrain our sexual desires. When some impending pain makes us afraid or fearful, then we will need fortitude. And when the behavior of others threatens to make us harsh and agitated toward them, then patience will be required. So we have the tools that we need, but that doesn't mean that these tools are necessarily readily available to us. Rather, it is only after we have been properly habituated that we will be protected from being overwhelmed by the phenomenon of existence. Facing life's challenges in a Stoic manner is more of a skill than a talent. It is something that must be trained through dedicated practice. Thus, we should not expect to be able to control our emotions and desires merely by reading Epictetus' Enchiridion and discourses. Self-control is a skill that requires cultivation, development, and conscious effort. We should expect to fail, and we will need the ability to diagnose our errors, learn from our mistakes, and rededicate ourselves to the Stoic life. But how do we embark on Stoic training? How do we begin to overcome emotions like disappointment, grief, and resentment? Epictetus believes that such emotions result from unfulfilled desire. There's something we want, but we don't get it. There's some goal we are attached and committed to, but that we fail to achieve. This is what causes us to be overwhelmed by negative emotion. So if the problem stems from being attached to certain outcomes, then of course we need to detach ourselves from those outcomes. Epictetus teaches us to avoid the following process of thought. If you would improve, lay aside such reasonings as these. If I neglect my affairs, I shall not have a maintenance. If I do not punish my servant, he will be good for nothing. Neglecting certain affairs, perhaps business opportunities or professional obligations, may prevent you from maintaining a certain standard of living. And your servant may very well become lazy if you never punish him. But if we focus on these outcomes, then it can be very easy for us to become fixated on them. Our desire to maintain our standard of living can make us prioritize making money over the cultivation of Stoic virtue. And if we are too focused on ensuring that our servant works effectively, then we will inevitably be disturbed and agitated by his mistakes. But of course, all of this undermines our efforts at Stoic training. For the Stoic, it would be better to die of hunger, exempt from grief and fear, than to live in affluence with perturbation. And better that your servant should be bad than you unhappy. If we adopt a goal-oriented or outcome-oriented focus, then grief and disappointment will inevitably be the result. And we will necessarily sacrifice any chance we have at Stoic composure and tranquility. Furthermore, in order to improve, Epictetus tells us that we must be content to be thought foolish and dull with regard to externals. Do not desire to be thought to know anything. Now, this might seem like strange advice, especially coming from a philosopher. Why should we be fine with other people thinking we don't know anything? Isn't knowledge good? Isn't knowledge something we should pursue? It is important to recognize here that Epictetus is talking specifically about knowledge of how to obtain external goods, and he believes we should accept others thinking we are foolish and dull on that topic. We should be comfortable with other people thinking we don't know how to obtain wealth, health, power, or social status. So Epictetus is not saying that we must eschew all knowledge. Rather, he is cautioning us against coveting the knowledge that would be claimed by, for example, modern-day YouTubers and podcasters who might promise their listeners that they have the key to financial or social success. But why is this? Does Epictetus really think it is inherently bad to know how to become wealthy, obtain political office, or make powerful friends? Well, not necessarily. However, we should think more about what would be required for us to have a reputation for having this kind of knowledge. For other people to think we are wise on these topics, they would need to see results. They would need to see in the real world that we have been successful in these things in the past. And while there's not necessarily anything wrong with these kinds of successes, the Stoic holds that there is something wrong with focusing our attention on this kind of success. That is because such a focus would imply that we care more about successfully obtaining external goods than about developing a Stoic character. But it is precisely this kind of focus which will be required for others to think we have knowledge about how to get these sorts of things. This is why it will not be easy at once to keep your will in harmony with nature and secure external goods. Attaining external goods requires precisely the commitment to seeking what is beyond our control that the Stoic way of life advocates against. Instead, we should look upon our own power and ability with more humility. In fact, we should adopt this humble outlook even if, perhaps especially if, others seem to think that we have expert knowledge of how to become wealthy, powerful, and successful. If we do gain such a reputation, we should instead distrust ourselves. Because the truth is that nobody can be an expert in what they cannot control. And nobody has the power to control whether or not they will possess external goods. So in our Stoic training, we should inculcate a sense of humility that encourages us to turn away from what is beyond our power and focus on the narrow sphere of life that we can control. That is, the discipline of our desires and our aversions. Achieving this sort of humility requires submitting ourselves to the force that controls the course of nature. Of course, given the quite limited scope of human power, we can be confident that force is not us. Rather, Epictetus refers to that force as God, and he argues that we must be humble enough to align our will with the will of God. His description of this point mirrors our previous discussion about the necessity of aligning our will and desires with nature. We must place our movements toward action in obedience to God. Is it His will that I shall have fever? It is my will also. Is it His will that I should move toward anything? It is my will also. Is it His will that I should obtain anything? It is my wish also. Does He not will? Then I do not wish. Is it His will that I be put to the rack? It is my will then to die. It is my will then to be put to the rack. No matter how painful or disappointing we may find the course of nature that is willed by God, we must embrace and accept it. After all, it is not within our power to ensure that the course of nature unfolds to our advantage. Whether we accept it or resist it, we must inevitably succumb to the will of God. Therefore, any attempt to make nature conform to our will be vain and futile. Furthermore, if we conform our will to God's will, then nobody will be able to hinder or compel us. Nobody will be able to disappoint us or thwart our plans because what we desire will be in perfect harmony with the will of God. As such, for a person to be able to hinder or compel us, they would need the ability to hinder or compel Zeus, but that is simply impossible for a mere mortal human being. As such, bringing our own will into accordance with the will of God not only protects us from harmful negative emotions, but also protects us against the predations of our potential enemies. Developing the humility to accept what is not within our power and the maturity to detach ourselves from any concern for external goods is, to put it bluntly, a monumental task. Our lives are largely oriented around the goals we wish to accomplish, so it may seem that detaching ourselves from those goals and ambitions would quite literally threaten to leave us without any direction, without any purpose. Despite the pain and grief that our desire for external goods causes us, it is easy to see where our attachment to them does come from. For this reason, when beginning Stoic training, Epictetus tells us to begin therefore with little things. We can see the wisdom of this advice by reflecting upon how difficult it is to face ordinary challenges with Stoic composure. How often do we find ourselves frustrated and distressed by small inconveniences? If it is already difficult to confront small setbacks without becoming agitated, then how much more difficult would it be to accept the possibility of failure in those goals which mean the most to us? How much more difficult will it be to remain composed and tranquil when our career ambitions fall apart, our social relationships are irreparably damaged, or if something horrible were to happen to a person we love? We cannot expect to meet these hardships with Stoic composure until we have formed our characters properly. As such, we should start small and first concentrate on accepting the tiny disasters of common life. For example, if a little oil is spilled or a little wine is stolen, we should remind ourselves that this is the price paid for peace and tranquility, and nothing is to be had for nothing. As a Stoic, our ultimate goal is the peace and tranquility that comes from maintaining our composure in any circumstance. However, it is simply impossible to go through life without encountering difficulties. It is simply not possible for everything to go smoothly and for our plans to always work out just as we would like. And this means that we have a choice. We can either insist unrealistically upon trying to live a life without any such disturbances, and inevitably have our expectations upset, which leads to agitation and annoyance, or we can accept that everyday disturbances are unavoidable and inevitable, and consequently, if we do this, have a chance at Stoic peace and tranquility. Whenever obstacles come our way, Epictetus reminds us that it is not at all desirable that it should be in the power of those obstacles to cause us any disturbance. Because life's difficulties are ubiquitous, and because it is natural for us to form unrealistic expectations, as Epictetus puts it in the Discourses, we need to practice Stoic acceptance from morning to evening, beginning with the smallest things and those most liable to damage. If we can learn to accept that our earthen pot or cup can break and inconvenience us, then we will eventually be able to take the same attitude toward more significant things. We will be able to accept that our dog or horse might fall ill or become injured, that things will eventually fall into disrepair on our small estate of land, and finally that we ourselves are liable to severe damage, that our body and its parts may fail us, and that all of this can happen as well to our brothers and those who we love. This is because while our attachment to our favorite cup, our house, our body, and our friend will be different in strength and intensity, the nature of all these attachments is structurally similar. In each case, there is some good, whether it be the usefulness of our house, the health of our body, or the companionship of our friend, that we desire and are attached to. Furthermore, these all make us vulnerable to disappointment, because we are attached to something that is finite, that must inevitably end, and that must inevitably be taken from us. This is why beginning with small things is so effective. Training ourselves to accept that our favorite cup is broken, that milk is spilled, or that we left our shopping list at home before going to the store is at first significantly easier than accepting, for instance, that we have been diagnosed with a serious illness or accepting the death of a loved one. Yet because all attachment has the same fundamental nature, once we have mastered accepting life's small setbacks, we will also thereby have the skills we need to calmly accept life's more severe hardships. Epictetus tells us that you will eventually be able to purge your opinions so that nothing cleaves to you of the things which are not your own, that nothing grow to you, that nothing give you pain when it is torn from you. Now, let's suppose that we take all this to heart. Suppose that we begin with small things, we cultivate virtues like patience and fortitude, and in the process we inculcate a sense of humility that allows us to accept what we cannot control. In other words, suppose that we are successful in our Stoic training. What is the result of all this? What is the payoff? More generally, we might say the payoff is happiness or a life well lived. But more specifically, one important outcome is the elimination of negative emotion. In the Discourses, Epictetus discusses the elimination of fear and grief. Once we have learned to accept the course of nature, there will be nothing left for us to fear. Do you still fear any man? Epictetus asks. No one, for about what will you be afraid? If we have completely accepted that the course of nature is beyond our control and eradicated any expectation that nature will unfold according to our particular wishes, then nothing another person does should make us upset, disappointed, or worried. But if we desire external goods, then we will always be susceptible to having our possession of those goods impeded by something or someone else, and consequently, we will always have some reason to be fearful. However, if we have accepted the unfolding of the course of nature and aligned ourselves with the will of God, then since no human can control the course of nature, we will never have any reason to fear the actions of another. Consequently, we will be without fear and disturbance. The same is true of grief. Epictetus tells us that fear comes from what we expect, whereas grief comes from what is already present. We fear the possible future occurrence of illness or death. We feel grief, on the other hand, when some good we had previously is taken away from us, like when a beloved friend or family member passes away. However, despite this difference, what is similar about these is their connection to desire and aversion. We feel afraid because we have an aversion to the possibility of some painful future event, something like illness or death. We feel grief because of our desire to keep a good that we used to possess, like the companionship of a deceased friend. Of course, the very point of Stoic training is to discipline our desires and aversions so that we desire nothing that is not within our control to attain, and are averse to nothing that is not within our power to avoid. As Epictetus puts it, of the things which are within the power of the will, you have a proper regulated desire. But of the things which are not in the power of the will, you do not desire any one. Once we have accomplished this, we will not allow any place to that which is irrational. It is unproductive and irrational to fear something that we cannot do anything about. Likewise, it is irrational and unproductive in Epictetus' view to grieve the loss of something that we knew could never be a permanent presence in our lives. With these comments, we can now see the connection between the two central topics of this video: the Stoic vision of a life well lived, as well as the process of training for the Stoic life. Stoic training contributes to the good life by allowing us to get rid of detrimental emotions that are based upon unrealistic expectations. And ultimately, it is this practice which enables us to escape the tyranny of unfulfilled desires and unattainable aspirations. It is this practice which permits us to live a life that characterizes the Stoic ideal, a life in which, through self-mastery, we can enjoy tranquility and freedom from disturbance.